Okay, so you think judo right, and you probably picture these incredible throws, someone getting launched through the air.
Yeah, those big highlight reel moments.
But here's the thing. In a judo match, a huge chunk of the fight is actually this kind of hidden battle for control, what we call grip fighting.
It can be mind-blowing to realize that sometimes grip fighting can actually take up like half the match.
Seriously, it's wild.
Yeah, and this whole art of grip fighting in judo, it's called Kumi Kata, and it's so much more than just grabbing the uniform, you know?
Right, it's like its own language almost.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, this flow of pressure and tiny adjustments. It really determines who's going to get that upper hand.
And that's what we're diving into today in this deep dive. It's all about Kumi Kata.
We're going to unlock this essential part of judo for you guys.
Yeah, for this we went deep. We looked at biomechanical studies, the physics of gripping.
We dug into coaching tips from judo legends.
And we even looked at stats from top-level matches to see how this plays out in real competition.
I think the big takeaway is that Kumi Kata, it's not just about holding on, it's about setting up your whole game plan.
Yeah, it's the foundation for those throws. It's how you defend yourself and ultimately how you control the whole flow of the match.
That's kind of a big deal.
So our goal today is to unpack all this complexity, starting with the basics,
Okay.
and then getting into the advanced stuff that you see at those elite levels.
We want to give you guys some real insights, whether you're a judo fanatic or you're just curious about how this combat stuff works.
Okay, so let's start with the fundamentals, the classical foundation of Kumi Kata. What are we looking at here?
So in classic judo training, you usually start with what's called Kihon Kumi Kata, which are the basic grips.
Okay.
The most basic one, the one you see everyone drilling, is the right hand on the opponent's left collar, like around the armpit, and the left hand on their right sleeve near the elbow.
Right, those are the grips you see beginners learning.
Exactly. It's the starting point, the most direct way to connect with your opponent.
And then from there, I remember reading that your arms, they're not just holding on. They're actually different roles they play, right? It's more active.
Absolutely. It's not passive at all.
Mm.
In Kumi Kata, your arms, they have four main jobs.
Four.
First, there's the active role, so using your arms to actually generate force to get that initial push going for a throw. Then there's the passive role, which is using your arms to block or stop your opponent's movements.
So that's the defense.
Exactly. You're shutting down their attacks right there with your arms.
Makes sense. So offense and defense already built in. So what are the other two?
Okay, so the third role is what we call advising your grips, or constantly giving you feedback about your opponent.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you're feeling subtle changes in their posture, their tension, even hints about what they might do next. Your hands are like sensors feeding you information live.
Wow.
And finally, the fourth role is alert. Your hands are always on the lookout for any sign of an attack, a shift in weight, a muscle tensing up, anything like that.
So it's this constant two-way communication through the hands.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that seemed counterintuitive is that the source material really stressed relaxed grips during those early stages of training. Why not go for a super tight grip right from the start?
Right. You'd think that would make sense. But when you're starting out, actually focusing on relaxed grips, both when you're attacking and defending, helps you to develop better sensitivity.
I see.
You can read your opponent's movements without tiring yourself out, and you learn to use just the right amount of force to get what you need.
So it's about developing that feel first.
Exactly. As you get better, you start to change your grips more strategically. You're always aiming to get an advantage where using the least amount of energy possible.
It's all about efficiency.
Exactly.
Now, there was this term athletes couple, which sounded pretty technical. Can you explain what that means, like in simple terms?
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting way to look at things. Instead of seeing the two judo players as individuals, we think of them as one interconnected system. So their balance, their movements, even how tense they are, it all gets linked together through their grips. It means that even if one person looks unstable on their own, the couple as a whole can still be balanced because they're pushing and pulling against each other, reacting to each other's movements.
So it's like they're supporting each other even while trying to throw each other.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox.
How does all this grip fighting, this Kumi Kata, affect their individual balance, though?
Well, research shows that when you're actively doing Kumi Kata, your muscles tend to tense up throughout your body.
Okay.
And you also tend to lean forward a bit onto the balls of your feet.
Makes sense. You're ready to move.
Yeah, you're primed for attack. But it also means your center of gravity is a little higher, which can make you vulnerable to certain throws if you're not careful.
So it's this trade-off between being ready to attack and staying stable.
Exactly, a constant balancing act.
Speaking of balance, the source material mentioned 3 basic guard positions: diagonal, normal, and curled up. How do these relate to Kumi Kata?
So these basic stances, they're mainly defined by how far apart the player's heads and feet are, and they really influence what kind of grips you're going to use and your overall game plan.
I see.
For example, if you're in a diagonal guard, where one side is much closer than the other, you might go for specific grips and attacks on that closer side.
Makes sense.
But if you're in a more normal balanced guard, you have more options for gripping and you can be more versatile.
So your foot position dictates your hand fighting.
Yeah, and then there's the curled up guard or jigotai, which is often used defensively to get really close and limit your opponent's options.
So these stances each come with their own set of preferred Kumi Kata and techniques.
Exactly.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of the grips themselves. What are the main goals when you're trying to establish a grip?
So the first goal is to get your tsurite in a good position.
Tsurite.
Yeah, it's basically your drawing or lifting hand, usually the one on the collar, and you want to use it to push your opponent backwards towards the mat.
Okay, to create that initial unbalance.
Right. The second goal is to secure your hikite, which is the pulling or locking hand, usually on the sleeve.
Gotcha.
This one's all about preventing your opponent from escaping or countering your throw.
So one hand pushes, one hand pulls.
Exactly. You're creating the setup for the throw.
So how do you actually get that tsurite, that collar grip, into that perfect pushing position?
It's a bit of a process. It starts with making contact wherever you can on their judogi, maybe the sleeve, the elbow, or the lapel. And then you apply downward pressure while keeping your hand close to your body.
Downward pressure.
Yeah. And at the same time, you lower your own body a little on that side. You're getting your center of gravity underneath your grip.
Okay.
This usually makes your opponent react. They try to resist, and that can give you an opening to adjust your grip higher up on the collar.
So you're using their reaction to your advantage.
Exactly.
The source material also talked about Hikite and Tsurite as long pull and short pull. What's the difference there?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The Hikite, the sleeve grip, is usually used for a longer pulling motion. It helps to open up the angle between their arm and their body, creating space for rotation.
And rotation is key for a lot of throws, right?
Exactly. Now, the Tsurite, the lapel grip, is more of a short, direct pull. It helps to pull your opponent forward off balance.
So Hikite guides and creates space. Tsurite pulls them in.
Precisely.
It also mentioned vertical and horizontal dimensions for gripping the arm. How do those affect things?
So the vertical dimension is where, on their arm, you're gripping between their elbow and shoulder. This really affects how much leverage you have. If you grip lower down near their wrist, you need their arm to be straight for your pull to really affect their shoulder.
And the shoulder is where you want that rotation to happen.
Right, but if you grip too high near their elbow, you might limit your own movement, even if you can pull more.
So it's a balance.
Yeah, and then the horizontal dimension is whether you're gripping more on the inside or outside of their sleeve. This affects the direction of your pull and how easily they can move their arm.
So tiny adjustments can make a big difference.
Absolutely, every detail matters.
What about the best way to pull with the Hikite? The material said it should be horizontal parallel to the mat. Why is that?
That's the most efficient way to pull biomechanically. A lot of people want to yank the arm upwards, but that actually limits how well you can unbalance them.
Interesting.
Key is to use your whole upper body along with your pulling hand. You want to rotate or shift your torso to add power to the pull. You're not just using your arm strength.
You're using your whole body.
Exactly.
And the Tsurite's role in creating forward unbalance, it said, can contribute like 25% of the force. How does that work?
So the Tsurite, remember, it's like your fishing hand. It pulls your opponent forward, and that movement comes from turning your arm at both the elbow and the shoulder.
Okay.
Now, a grip higher up on the collar gives you more leverage for that forward pull, but it also requires more strength from you and can limit your own movement.
So there's that trade-off again.
Yeah, a lower grip might be less powerful, but it gives you more freedom to move your own arms and legs.
So what's the strongest position for the Tsurite then?
The biomechanically strongest position is when your elbow is tucked in close to your body and your hand is right above it.
Okay.
A straight arm actually has way less lifting power.
So it's all about those small details in body positioning.
Exactly.
And I noticed that the material pointed out how experienced athletes, they're always changing their grips during a match, especially the Tsurite. Why is that?
So top judo players, they're constantly adjusting their grips as part of their strategy.
Oh, interesting.
They might be trying to get a better hold to set up a specific throw or to counter what their opponent is doing.
I see.
And they change the Tsurite more often because it gives them more options for fine-tuning the angle and direction of their pull. They're looking for weaknesses in their opponent's stance and setting up their attacks.
It's like a chess match happening with their hands.
Absolutely. It's a constant back and forth, a feeling out process.
Okay, so now let's talk about how all this grip fighting plays out in a real high-stakes match. The source material mentioned different models for breaking down a match into steps. How do analysts typically look at this?
Yeah, there are a few common ways to analyze the flow of a judo match. One way is to divide it into phases like mate, which is when the referee stops the action.
Okay,
Preparation, where the players are moving around but not touching grip, which is the Kumi Kata battle throws fall, which is when a throw lands, and groundwork.
right.
Another model looks at things like mobility Kumi Kata preparation tachiwaza, which is standing techniques, transition, which is moving between standing and groundwork, and then nawaza, which is groundwork.
So it's about breaking down the match into chunks that you can analyze.
Exactly. And the important thing to remember is that these phases, they all flow into each other. What you do in one phase affects what happens next.
Oh, connected.
Yeah, for example, if you win the grip fight, you're in a much better position to land your favorite throw.
Now there's this idea of the biomechanics grips paradox, which sounds pretty counterintuitive considering we've been talking so much about grips.
Mm.
What is that about?
This is a really important point. Even though the position and strength of your grips are obviously crucial for throwing someone, the grips paradox basically says that your foot position and how stable you are, that's actually the most important thing.
Really?
Yeah, your feet and legs, they're the foundation for your grips. They give you the stability to transfer power from your arms to your opponent. You could have the strongest grip in the world, but if your feet aren't right, you won't be able to throw anyone.
It's like trying to push a car on ice.
Exactly. You need that solid base.
Okay, and then there were these competition invariants, these guard positions that the athletes keep coming back to. Can you explain those?
Yeah, these competition invariants or guard positions, they're basically the stable positions and grips that the two players settle into during a match.
Yeah.
We can classify them based on the distance between their heads and feet, and they're also linked to how fast the players are moving.
So different positions for different speeds.
Right. The study we looked at, it found 6 different classes of these invariants, each with a higher level of movement and speed.
So by understanding how fast your opponent likes to move and what their favorite guard position is, you can actually predict what techniques they might use.
Exactly. It's like figuring out their tells in poker, but instead of facial expressions, you're reading their body language and grips.
Now, we also talked about some outmoded grips, like the double lapel and double sleeve grips. Why aren't they used so much anymore?
Yeah, these grips were definitely more popular back in the day. The double lapel grip, where you control both of your opponent's lapels, it gives you a lot of control over their torso. It makes it harder for them to rotate and do certain throws.
Makes sense.
But the downside is you lose control of their sleeves. So it's a trade-off.
Okay. And what about the double sleeve grip?
The double sleeve grip is really good for pulling throws like sodatsuri komigoshi. It was probably more common when weight classes weren't as strict because it could give smaller players an advantage.
So they both have their uses, but they're not as versatile as the standard grips.
Right. They might work as a surprise tactic or in specific situations, but you don't see them that much at the top level anymore.
Okay. And the source material mentioned research connecting certain grip types to specific throwing techniques. What were some of those connections?
Researchers have found some interesting links. For example, if someone grips the back of your collar, they're probably going for a hanging type throw where they use your collar to support their weight as they go under you.
Okay.
Grips on the side or front of the collar were also linked to hanging throws.
Gotcha.
Now, for pulling throws, grips around the collar or armpit were often used for makikomi waza, which are winding throws, and katsugi waza, which are shoulder-carrying techniques.
Okay.
Gripping near the elbow was associated with a wider range of throws like osotogari and uchimata, which are reaping throws.
So more versatile.
Exactly. And gripping closer to the sleeve was often preferred for throws like ipansoi nage and tome nage.
So your grip choice basically sets you up for certain throws.
It really shapes your attack options.
The source material also mentioned a higher risk of ACL injuries in Kinkyotsu situations. What is Kinkyotsu and why is it riskier?
So Kinkyotsu is when the two players have opposite stances. One's right-handed, the other's left-handed. It creates a mirror image situation.
Okay.
Research shows that ACL injuries are more likely to happen in these opposite stance matches compared to Aiotsu, where both players have the same stance.
That's interesting.
And the worst part is these injuries usually happen when you're defending against an attack, especially a technique called osotogari.
So it's something to be aware of.
Definitely the angles of force in these opposite stance situations put a lot of stress on the knee.
Something to keep in mind both for training and competition.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to the timing of a match, specifically before and during grips.
Yeah.
The material talked about first grip analysis. What is that all about?
So first grip analysis focuses on that very first moment of contact between the players when they start fighting for grips, right after the referee says, Hajime. Researchers look at things like how long it takes to get that first grip, how often grips are broken and reestablished, and most importantly, where on the judogi they make that first contact.
So it's all about those crucial first few seconds.
Exactly. Those initial exchanges can set the tone for the whole match.
And were there any interesting findings about these first grips?
They found some differences between men and women. For both, the most common target for the first grip was a lapel,
Okay.
but the second most common target was different. For women, it was the leg, while for men, it was the wrist hand area.
Oh, wow. That's a big difference.
Yeah, and other areas like the sleeve and the back were less common. The belt was almost never the first point of contact.
So men and women have different preferences for that initial grab.
It seems that way.
And how long does it usually take to establish that first grip?
On average, it takes about 5 seconds after the start of the gripping phase, and half of all first grips happen between 3 and 9 seconds.
So pretty quick.
Yeah, it rarely takes longer than 14 seconds.
It's a fast transition from bowing to fighting. And how many of these grip fighting phases happen in a typical match?
The study found an average of 15 grip fighting phases per match,
15.
which really shows how much of the match is dedicated to Kumi Kata.
It's not just a small part, it's a huge part of the fight.
Absolutely.
The material also described grip fighting as a kind of power-based arm wrestling. But then it brought up the judo principle of JU, which is all about using your opponent's force against them. How do those two ideas fit together?
It's true that strength is important in grip fighting, especially at the beginning when you're trying to get a dominant grip.
Right.
But JU is about being smarter and more efficient. You use flexibility technique and your opponent's own energy to your advantage instead of just trying to overpower them.
So it's not just about brute force.
Exactly. The best judo players, they combine strength with JU. They use technique and leverage to beat even stronger opponents.
So it's like being a judo ninja.
You could say that.
Now let's talk about this deeper grip concept. The source material challenged the idea that you always need a strong grip to throw someone. That seems kind of radical.
It is. It all comes down to the different types of throwing techniques. There are a couple of forces throws, also called general action invariants, which are basically movements that shorten the distance between you and your opponent.
Yeah.
And then there are lever group throws, or specific action invariants, which need more complex movements and leverage to work.
So two different categories of throws.
Right, and what's interesting is that for a couple of forces throws, you don't always need a super strong traditional grip. These throws can sometimes go straight into the execution without much unbalancing beforehand.
Like they flow naturally.
Exactly, gravity does a lot of the work for you. But lever group throws, they usually need a more deliberate unbalancing phase, and that's where a strong grip comes in handy.
So some throws need a strong grip, others don't.
It depends on the mechanics of the throw.
Okay, and then there was this concept of sen no sen on grips, attacking while your opponent is trying to grip you. Can you explain that?
Sen no sen is all about attacking preemptively right when your opponent is about to do something.
Okay.
In grip fighting, it means taking advantage of those moments when your opponent is off balance because they're busy trying to grab you.
It's like catching them off guard.
Exactly. It's a very effective but often overlooked tactic.
You mentioned two approaches to this, a two-step method and a one-step method. What's the difference?
The two-step method is basically you break their grip, then attack.
Simple enough.
But at a high level, that often doesn't work because breaking their grip gives them time to recover. The one-step method is much more effective. It's about using their attempt to grip you against them.
How do you do that?
The source material gives the example of Won-hee Lee, the Korean champion. He would let his opponent grab him and then use that grip as leverage to throw them. He'd stabilize their arm with both of his hands, turn his body, lower his center of gravity, and bam, throw.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's the perfect example of using your opponent's energy against them. True, Jayu.
Okay, now let's talk about breaking symmetry. What does that mean in judo?
So breaking symmetry is basically forcing your opponent out of a balanced stance. You make them bend, turn, or shift their weight unevenly. This makes them less mobile, harder to unbalance, and easier to throw.
So you're setting them up for your attack.
Exactly. It's a subtle but crucial part of high-level judo.
And what are the steps in a typical high-level attack after you break their symmetry?
After you disrupt their balance, the next step is to close the distance quickly using what we call a general action invariant. This lets you get in close while also dealing with any grips they might have.
Okay.
Then you have a strong body collision, which really drives home that unbalancing. Then finally, you execute the throw itself.
So disrupt balance, close distance, collide, and throw.
Exactly. And all of this happens in a split second. It takes incredible timing and precision.
Definitely. The material also mentioned managing time and space in something called Hando no Kuzushi. What is that?
Hando no Kuzushi basically means reaction unbalancing. It's a very advanced skill where you use your opponent's reactions to your own movements to further unbalance them.
So you're anticipating their response.
Yeah, they're going to push back when you pull or try to regain balance when you shift your weight. So you use that to your advantage.
You're always one step ahead.
Exactly, and it lets you set up your throws much faster and more efficiently.
It's all about maximizing efficiency.
That's judo in a nutshell.
Now, the source material talked about sportive rational techniques and irrational solutions. What's that all about?
So, sportive rational techniques are basically the classic, tried and true judo throws that everyone learns. These are the techniques you see in textbooks and in most competitions.
Okay, the standard stuff.
Right, but at the highest levels of competition, where everyone's super skilled, it can be really hard to use these classic techniques effectively. That's where irrational solutions come in. There are two types: innovative form and chaotic form. Innovative form techniques are basically variations on the classic throws. They use different grips or entry methods, but the basic mechanics are the same.
So like a remix of a classic song.
Exactly. Chaotic form techniques are more radical. They use unconventional leverage and body positioning. They might look weird, but they still work.
So they're breaking the rules, but not the laws of physics.
Exactly.
And it said that innovative form is more common with couple throws, while chaotic form is more common with lever throws. Why is that?
Couple throws are generally simpler mechanically. They're more about direct force, so it's easier to tweak the grips or entry without changing the core of the throw.
Okay.
But lever throws are more complex. They need very specific leverage and coordination. So there's more room to experiment with body positioning and force application, which leads to those chaotic form variations.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
The more complex the system, the more ways you can tweak it.
Oh.
And finally, the source material touched on how different national styles influence gripping and throwing. Can you talk about the Korean, Russian, and Japanese styles?
Over the years, different countries have developed their own judo styles based on their history and training philosophies.
Oh, interesting.
The Korean style is known for being very dynamic and eclectic. They use fast movements, creative grips, and lots of innovative and sometimes chaotic techniques.
So they're always pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, they're very creative. The Russian style is more strong classic. They focus on powerful throws, often from unusual grips, which comes from their sambo wrestling background.
So strength and tradition.
Exactly. And the Japanese style is all about high traditional judo. They emphasize perfect technique, precise timing, and adaptability to any grip. They're less focused on innovation or chaos and more on mastering the fundamentals.
So each style has its own personality. Let's shift gears now and talk about women's judo. The source material said it's a different landscape compared to men's judo. What are some of the key biomechanical differences between men and women that might explain this?
So generally, women have less upper body strength and grip strength than men.
Okay.
Studies have shown that even elite female judo athletes can have weaker grips than untrained men.
Really?
But women often have greater flexibility and joint laxity. So there are these trade-offs.
Oh, less raw power, but more flexibility.
Exactly. And that affects the techniques and strategies you see in women's judo.
How so?
Well, statistically, women use fewer hand techniques and more groundwork than men.
Interesting.
Their grip fighting might be less about strength and their attacks might be a bit slower. And you see less chaotic form techniques because those often need a lot of strength.
So they might favor techniques that use their strengths.
Exactly. They often prefer techniques that utilize their lower body strength and flexibility, like throws that use the trunk and legs, or winding throws that involve some arm action. But they also use sacrifice throws that emphasize body weight and leg action rather than pure arm strength.
So it's a different game, but equally exciting.
Absolutely.
And the source material pointed out that women's judo is hugely important globally. In fact, the top countries can sometimes be different when you look at just the women's results. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, if you look at the medal standings from big judo events and you focus only on the women's results, you'll sometimes see a different set of countries at the top compared to the overall rankings or the men's rankings.
So women's judo is changing the landscape.
It really is. It shows that women are playing a bigger and bigger role in judo worldwide. And some countries are really investing in their women's programs, which is great to see.
It's a testament to the power of women's judo.
Definitely.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive into Kumi Kata. What are the key things our listeners should remember?
The biggest takeaway is that Kumi Kata, it's not just about grabbing, it's about strategy. It's about feeling your opponent, controlling the distance, setting up attacks, and stopping their attacks. It's an essential part of judo, from the beginner level all the way to the Olympics.
And it was surprising to learn that you don't always need a perfect grip to throw someone.
Yeah.
You can use biomechanics and JU to your advantage.
Yeah, and the whole concept of innovative and chaotic techniques shows that judo is always evolving. People are finding new and creative ways to win.
So as a final thought for everyone listening, think about how these ideas about grip fighting and biomechanics could apply to other areas of life.
Yeah, where else can you leverage your opponent's force or find those moments of imbalance that you can exploit?
It's about looking deeper and seeing the hidden opportunities.
Exactly.
And of course, there's so much more to learn about judo.
Yeah, this was just a taste. We encourage everyone to keep exploring and learning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.